So I guess we're here to talk about the budget. You are concerned about a cliff, and I think you feel like you're being underfunded. So can you tell us about that?
So one of the things that we are hoping, or we're hoping to do, is utilize the funding that's coming through the Rescue Act to really provide the additional services and support the student will need coming back in September as a result of learning loss and some of the challenges that they faced through the pandemic. Now we had to kind of rethink and restructure how we're utilizing that funding because of the fact that we were not provided the increase that we were expecting, at a minimum the 2%, so that we could reduce the amount of things that that we had to cut, because we had asked for 4.6% to meet the contractual obligations as well as the medical the insurance increase that we had this year. By not having that, we had to make certain reductions, which we did, but we were not expecting to be zero funded, for lack of a better word. And now we have to think about how do we strategically utilize the Relief Act funds to kind of mitigate the fact that we're not getting the funding that we were hoping for, and two, limit the amount of cuts that we need to make, because cuts mean layoffs, it means reduction of staff, reduction of services, which is the last thing we want to do when we're trying to support our students in many more strategic ways than we had in the past, right? Because they didn't have the challenges that COVID has created. So I think Tom can speak to some of the numbers and where we are in terms of where we started in the process and where we wound up, and some of the challenges that, as a result of not getting the requested funding, will create long-term for us, and some of the unintended consequences of some of the decisions that are being made now, particularly the cliff that we will have to face 2 years from now.
So the budget that was approved by our board, they actually revised the budget they originally submitted after we received updated health insurance numbers in early February. And so our board submitted a revised budget to the city that totaled just over $218 million, which was about a 9.6%, or 9.6 million increase, or about 4.6% increase. And in order to fund, as the superintendent said, the salary increases and the health insurance increases, that was the amount of money that we needed. We obviously saw the city finance director's recommendation at 2%. We made a push, and we're hoping that the Board of Estimate was going to be a little more generous than that. And in our meeting with the Board of Estimate, had suggested that a number of about 3.2% could get us where we felt we needed to go to. But now, based on the tentative action of the Board of Estimate, they still have one more meeting, obviously, in early May to make adjustments if they so decide. But at this point, based on the tentative budget they've set, it's pretty clear the city has sent a directive, in essence, or a mandate that the Board of Education is expected to use the federal grant money to balance the budget and to cover the shortfalls. And so what that means is really we need to, based on our latest review of the numbers, sort of as low as we can cut the numbers down at about $216.3 million, which is about a 7.8 or $7.9 million increase, or 3.8%. So based on the decision from the Board of Estimate, we are going to need to find ways to cover about $7.9 million worth of expenses from the various federal grants that are available, which is the the ESSER II grant, and then the American Relief, do I have the name right?
Act. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Rescue plan.
American Rescue Plan
Right,
Act.
right.
The American Rescue Plan Act, with about $7 million from the American Rescue Plan Act. So that's really what we're doing, is we're balancing the budget using those federal resources. And as the superintendent said, our concern with that is twofold. One, the money was intended and appropriated to provide additional resources to school districts to meet the extraordinary additional needs that our students face as a result of COVID. So instead of directing those resources to additional student interventions, instead of directing those resources to additional summer school programs and additional educational time for our students, and additional social and emotional supports, we're really going to be using those funds to balance the budget. And so, we're feel that's not the most productive use of those extraordinary funds, number one, because they are one-time, it's really a one-time source of funding. We don't expect this grant to continue beyond the next 2 years. That the indication from the federal government is the funds can be spent over the next 2 years. And so our preference would be to use them for extraordinary expenses that we would incur over the next 2 years, both the student support services as well as other one-time expenses. We know that a number of districts are talking about using these funds for, in some cases, capital expenses. We know recently that our facilities study, which is going to be presented tomorrow to the board, one of the areas that they've identified for improvement, and one of the areas that a number of organizations have suggested that the relief grants can be used for, is indoor air quality concerns. So that would be a terrific use of funds, because it would be a one-time expense that's being supported from a one-time revenue. But to the extent that we're being placed in a position where we're in essence being required to use these funds to balance the budget, what it does by definition is it creates a fiscal cliff that the district and the city will have to deal with when those funds are no longer available to support our ongoing expenses. So one of the issues is whether or not, this policy from the city is it a one-year policy that's going to apply to the 21-22 budget, or is it going to continue to the 22-23 budget? We had shared some numbers with our board finance committee last week, and if the policy were to continue, not only for the current year, for 21-22, but to continue into 22-23. And in other words, if the budget were held flat or artificially flat for a second year, it then creates in the third year, when those funds go away, a rather large cliff, a cliff of almost $28 million. And we think that would be really short-sighted and would put the district and the city in a difficult position. So certainly hope that, assuming the Board of Estimate sticks with this plan and, provides no increase in the base Board of Ed budget and indicates we should use our federal grant funding to cover the normal ordinary increase in the 21-22 budget, we certainly hope that that doesn't set the stage to continue that in the following year, because in the following year, if you do that in the following year, it's really almost like doubling down on that policy, and it makes the cliff that much larger.
Okay. Well, I don't understand. I did some math, and with your $7.2 million from the federal ARP going toward just balancing, meeting your expenses, you still have something like 4 million left in ARP funds that you could use this year, maybe 5. Why isn't that enough? And your budget also included some supports for the kids. You had literacy specialists and math specialists. You were trying to beef that up in anticipation of the need before we knew that there would be an ARP. So can you explain why you feel like an extra $5 million is not enough?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One, the needs are substantial. The student needs are substantial in terms of catching them up, dealing with the learning loss, dealing with social and emotional issues, number one. Number two, the funding is available over a 2-year period, so we always felt that we don't want to provide additional services, support services for a 1-year period. We think at a minimum, these services are really needed for a 2-year period. So you've got to really look at breaking the amount of money down over a 2-year period rather than a 1-year period.
I did.
Okay.
So how much money are you getting from ARP? It's like $25 million, isn't it?
They haven't given us the final numbers in terms of how much exactly we're getting.
Okay.
It's been estimated around 22.9 million.
Okay.
So and depending who you speak to, you get different sums of money in terms of what the exact allocation for the district is, because it hasn't yet been fully determined.
Okay.
So we're working based on an estimate in terms of what is the allotted amount of funds. And think about it, we have funding for 2 years. We're assuming that the gaps will be closed in a period of 2 years. It might take longer. So we have to be very strategic in terms of how we think about resources and how we're utilizing resources to accelerate learning, right? So part of what we need to do in these 2 years with the funding that we're receiving is create the opportunities necessary to accelerate learning, because past that point, we most likely won't receive any additional funds.
Right.
But now that we have to reappropriate the funds in different ways, we are limited in terms of how much of this money we could effectively utilize to support students in the way that they need to, and the way this funding was intended to. I don't think that this funding, when the federal government set this bill forward, was intended to supplant. It was intended to be in addition to. And right now, the way that it's being utilized is to supplant versus provide the additional supports and services that everybody knows are going to be necessary to continue to move students forward as a result of everything that's happened in the past year.
Okay.
So the challenge is that now we are having to reshift the intentions of what this funding was first designated for. Right? It wasn't meant to supplant the budget and to cover costs that were normally being incurred in the district over time. They were meant to be in addition to. And unfortunately, because of the fact that now we're using most of the budget to cover what has not been funded, that is basically the normal budgetary increases based on contractual obligations and the unexpected insurance hike that we had to deal with. Now we have to re-strategize how we're going to continue to support students effectively, because now we have less resources than we had originally anticipated, because that 22.9 million was supposed to provide additional services and supports, not supplant.
Okay.
I think the second piece of this is that a lot of, there's a lot of COVID expenses that we have this year that might continue to the upcoming school year. We still don't know when students ages 15 and below will be vaccinated. And as a result of that, we still have to continue to follow all of the CDC guidelines and precautionary measures. As a result of that, there's a cost associated with that we initially didn't calculate into the overall budget, because we were counting on these additional federal dollars that were coming in to address those expenses. Now, we're in a situation where we have to use this money to cover the budget and supplant money to balance the budget. And then on top of that, we need to figure out how much funding we're gonna need next year if we need to continue to maintain the measures that we currently have around safety and well-being of our students for another year. When you start putting those numbers together, there's no money left for the instructional component that is essential for us to move forward. There's not enough money left to do the social emotional work that is necessary as a result of what's happened with COVID. And that's where the challenge lies, right? That we have all of these factors that we need to take into consideration, and it was very clear what the money was intended for, yet now we have to basically shift how we're using these resources and not really focus them in the areas that they were intended to be used.
Okay. How would it look different if they hadn't done this? If you could take all that money and apply it toward addressing learning losses and making sure the kids don't get infected, have social distancing and stuff, what would it look like?
So I think a chunk of the money would encompass first maintaining the safety and well-being of students, thinking about social distancing, what that needs to look like next year, given the COVID cases in the area. And I'm pretty sure that even though by the summer we probably get more people immunized, we still have to follow CDC protocols, making sure we have mass sanitation, oh my God, I lost the term, hand sanitizers, and all of the other cleaning agents that are necessary to keep the schools clean and safe, coupled with the additional hours that it takes to clean and maintain the buildings as a result of all of the sanitation processes that our custodians have to fulfill. Added to the added expense of our HVAC system and how we have the filters that we're using now to keep our students safe have an additional cost. We also have HEPA filters in every single classroom that require filter replacements that cost $70 each, and we have over 1,000 in the district in every classroom. So these are just a few examples of the many expenses that we have that this money was intended to be utilized for, coupled with bringing in additional social workers and guidance counselors to support our students, bringing in additional personnel to provide intervention services for students that might be lagging behind because they had a significant amount of learning loss. So all of these factors were things that we were developing a plan of action that now we have to regroup and redesign because we don't have the resources to do it the way that we had anticipated moving this work forward with the additional resources that we were getting through the Relief Act.
Okay. Obviously, the kids have suffered. We all know they're behind. You know, they're going to need extra help. Can you quantify that? I mean, what kind of indications do you see from the kids that indicate how they're doing and what help they'll need?
So a lot of what we have different assessments that we're using to determine where they are in terms of their reading proficiency, mathematics proficiency, anecdotals from teachers, classroom assessments that help us identify where our students are at. And we're constantly measuring and assessing because now things are a little different, right? When they're home, how you monitor and assess looks very different than when they are in person. So there's also a lot of variability in terms of the accuracy of some of our of some of the data that we're collecting from the assessments, because they're not all happening in school. Some of them are happening at home. But even with that, we have found that there's a significant number of our students that are going to need extensive interventions and supports. Through the current guidance support that we have, we've identified a lot of additional services are going to be needed to support a lot of the students in the district because they've experienced loss. Mm-hmm. They've experienced hardships, either they have food insecurity, they've experienced depression because they're home for an extensive amount of hours. They don't get to go out, socialize, and interact with their peers as they used to. And we want to make sure that upon entry, that our students can get the support that they need so that they can address some of these challenges that they're facing. But even if we continue to offer a remote option, that we have those added supports so that they know how to cope with some of the things that they're experiencing, that they might not know how to manage at this time and need someone to guide them through the experience. And we really want to do right for our children. And I understand that there is a cost associated and everybody is financially suffering. But I think if we think about the long-term impact of not funding schools well and providing the services necessary for our children to be successful, the loss long-term will be greater than if we try to address some of the challenges now and make sure our students stay on track and on a positive path forward to do the work that they need to have a successful life.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, when you look at things, if our schools succeed, our communities succeed. If our children succeed, our communities succeed, because they will be the future of Norwalk. And if they don't have what they need now, it's going to have an impact in how things move forward in the community at large. So we have to make sure that we keep that in mind as we continue to make decisions that might have drastic impacts in our children's lives and futures.
Okay. Regarding the cliff, they've been kind of hinging their hopes for 2 years from now on an efficiency study, and they think maybe that will save enough money that the cliff won't be so bad. What do you think about the efficiency study? I mean, are you optimistic about it finding many ways to have it cut expenses?
I think the efficiency study is a necessary thing to do so that people understand where we can either combine costs, improve the processes that we might have in place. Knowing how short-staffed certain departments are, I don't know if it's going to yield savings, but it will at least provide information of where we are as a district in collaboration with the city, and what things we could potentially do better to continue to strengthen processes that might reduce costs or might create a situation where we might need additional people, because the efficiency studies demonstrate that certain processes could be done better if it was better staffed. So it could go either way. It could create a reduction in terms of the amount of funding being utilized, or it might increase it, depending on how it's approached and looked at. And remember, they're looking at particular departments. They're looking at finance, they're looking at HR, and both in the city and in the BOE.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not optimistic that it's going to create extensive savings. I think that it will provide a lot of valuable information of how we could potentially become more efficient in a collaborative way between the city and us, and find ways that we could potentially join forces in certain aspects of the work. But I don't know if it's going to create the level of reduction that people are anticipating.
Okay. And there's a level of mistrust. Maybe, do you think it would help with that?
I think it should, right? Because it would allow people to really understand what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's always a lot of speculation about how things are done, and this will bring light to some of that. I think also one of the things that the mayor and I have had conversations about is having more collaborative conversations on a more regular basis, so that everybody understands where the work is. So instead of waiting for budget season to hit us, and then we want to have conversations about resources and funding, having this ongoing dialogue throughout the year. So the mayor and I are going to work towards setting up time, at least on a quarterly basis, to meet in collaboration with Common Council and the BET to talk about where we are with the work, what are some of the needs, some of the challenges. So by the time we get it to the table to talk about next year's budget, people have a little bit more clarity about how we're thinking what resources are needed and how those resources will be used.